everybody again for joining us. Thank you for all you for hosting us, and thank you everybody for coming. So let's just do if I may, it can never hurt to do a quick recap of everything we learned. And I hope that everybody stays with us until the end. I'm thinking that this is the third part on the abortion topic. As a teaser, we're going to move on. The next topic, God willing, will be brain death. Okay, so because this is the topic, abortion is about the beginning of life, brain death is about the end of life. Okay, so in the end, I think we'll give a beautiful summary, a really neat synopsis of everything that we've learned. But in the meantime, let's just do a synopsis of everything we've learned until now.
Rabbi, can you move the mic to the other side?
The other side?
Oh, thank you so much.
Better?
That's phenomenal.
Phenomenal, okay. So, we talked about a whole bunch of quite interesting questions, moral questions about cases where you have to do abortion to save a life. We saw the vast consensus of all the Rishonim that Uber lav nefesh, and Uber is not a soul. The main proof was from the pasuk in Shema Yisrael Aleph, Kinatzu Noshem, when there's a fist fight between people, and if a man causes a woman to miscarry, that's not an ason, that's not all the loss of life. We also saw the Mishnah in Daf Men Gimel Amud Beis in Ida that says that if somebody murders a baby at 1 day old, he's subject to capital punishment. It's the pasuk says V'ish kiyaku kol nefesh. Kol nefesh means any level of nefesh. So the Rishonim inferred kol nefesh. That only includes a baby from 1 day and onwards. That infers that a fetus is not a nefesh, and that was the opinion of the Ramban and the Rajba and the Ritva, the Ran. Sure?
Does 1 day mean like 1 minute?
So the Rashi in Sanhedrin Ayin Beis Mishiat La'avir Ha'olam, when it goes out into the air of the world.
In other words, not a full day.
Yeah. The moment, exactly, correct. The moment that it goes into the air of the world. That's also what Rashi and Ayin Beis said, the Yad Ramah, the Meiri, many other Rishonim. That's basically the accepted opinion of all the Rishonim. Until the Rambam came along, and the Rambam said that if a woman is going through a dangerous childbirth, and the life of the mother is being threatened because the child is attempting to exit, so the Rambam says that you kill the child because he's a rodef. A rodef is a pursuer, somebody who's attempting to kill somebody else, so he's subject to the death penalty without a jury, without a trial. So the question is, why does the Rambam need to say he's a rodef? The Rambam ignores the reason in the Mishnah. Let's Perek Zayin Mishnah Vav. The Mishnah said the reason is because Yeshua, the wording of the Mishnah is Mitnei shechaya koid min lechayav. Her life is more important than his life, and all the Rishonim said that he's not a nefesh. That's the first difficulty. The second difficulty is the Gemara said he's not a rodef. The Gemara says V'shamayah karatz filei. In heaven is pursuing, heaven is causing the mother to be in danger. So we saw the explanation of Rav Moshe Feinstein. I refer you back to listen to part 2 of the abortion shir to hear Rav Moshe Feinstein's explanation. But Rav Moshe Feinstein wanted to say that the position of the Rambam is that he is a nefesh, unlike all the other Rishonim. He had explanation how to reconcile the Rambam with the Gemara. I refer you back to the last shir. We preferred, or I thought that I made a good case, I say humbly, we made a good case because nobody objected, to the explanation of Rav Chaim Ozer Berdensky. Okay, Rav Chaim Ozer Berdensky says, indeed the Gemara said that the child is not a rodef, but the Gemara meant to say he's not a rodef until he sticks his head out. The moment that he sticks his head out, right, then he's no longer a rodef. It must be that the Rambam must have viewed that from a medical perspective, meaning to say that when the child attempts to exit his head out, his head is the largest part of the body or the most difficult part to get out of the uterus. I'm going to address that point about the uterus because one of the other online listeners wanted to point something out about that. But the Rabbi must have believed that when the child is attempting to exit his head, then he's threatening the mother by either by causing an artery to burst, which could cause excessive bleeding to the mother, or that might cause the amniotic fluids to enter into the bloodstream. But once the head is out, the Rambam said from a medical perspective, he's not doing anything actively to endanger the mother. If the mother still is in danger, it's either because it's something the child had done already, or because they need a point of access to operate, but it's not the child who's actively causing the mother to be in danger. Okay, that was the position of Chaim Oizer Grudensky. So when the Gemara says that the child is not a rodef, that's after he stuck his head out, but before he sticks his head out, then the child is a rodef. Why did the Rambam need to say he's a rodef? The Rambam shouldn't need to say that. The Gemara, he's not a nefesh. So Chaim Oizer Grudensky, correct? He's not a nefesh. The Rishonim made a very compelling case. The Pasuk says that it's not an ason. A child is not a nefesh. The Gemara neither. The Mishnah neither said that he's not a nefesh. The Rambam is not going to disagree with that. But the Rambam held that when the child is akar, which means that when he uproots himself, when he starts the attempt to exit, so then he already gets an upgrade in status, which has strong basis in the Gemara Erechin on Daf Zayin. The Gemara Erechin on Daf Zayin said that you can execute a woman together with the fetus, but once the child uproots himself, which means the mother went into labor, then the child has an upgrade in status, and then you're not allowed to execute the mother. Okay, we saw the Mishnah, we saw the Gemara Erechin, which gave us a few important principles. The first important principle is that if a woman needs to be executed, you execute the fetus together with the mother because it's gufa, it's part of her body. First principle. The second principle, in addition to fetus being part of the mother's body, it's also property of the husband. Number 3, we said that once the child uproots himself, he already has he has a different status, which the way of Chaim Oizer Grudensky explains the Rambam, it means that once a woman goes into labor and the child uproots himself, he does have the status of a nefesh. And the other principle is that we're chalel at the Shabbat, that we do what would otherwise be a desecration of the Shabbat in order to save the life of a fetus, which means that if they had to carry a knife through a public domain, 4 amot, 4 cubits through a public domain, they would do so in order to save the life of a fetus, to cut the mother open and take the baby out of the womb. Okay? So that's basically the best and cleaner, the explanation of the Rambam that fits best with the wording of the Gemara. Mishamaya karatve, that once the head is out, he's no longer causing the mother to be in danger. That's something that's part of nature. Okay, we saw the Ramban in Shar Mechosh, very important Ramban that says that we desecrate the Shabbat even in order to save a baby before it's reached the 40-day mark after conception, which is significant because the Gemara in Yevamot of Samachet says that before 40 days, the child is Maya Ba'alma. He doesn't have the status of even a fetus. It's like nothing more than water, yet, surprisingly, we do desecrate what would otherwise be desecration of the Shabbat to save his life. Why? Because he carries the potential for life. Shabbat achad, it's worthwhile to desecrate one Shabbat so that this potential life should be born and then should observe many Shabbatot, which I should add an important point. The Bir Halach and Shilam, it says it doesn't have to literally be Shabbat. Every moment of life, every moment that a Jewish child is alive and breathing, even if he's not technically observing Shabbat, but that's tantamount to observing Shabbat. Okay? Because the value of life itself is the equivalence of observing Shabbat. Okay? Why is that relevant? Because even if, let's say, you could know that the child is going to be born, won't be subject to any obligation of mitzvot. He's going to be what the Mishnah terms as a shota. Okay? He'll be totally invalid, right? For lack of a better term, excuse me. Right? And he won't technically observe any mitzvah. That doesn't matter. He doesn't actually have to observe the Shabbat. Okay, because that's an important point that we should bear in mind. Okay. That takes us to the next section of the Shir. Okay, so after we've seen the consensus of the Rishonim that an Uber doesn't have the status of a nefesh, assuming that even the Rambam agrees until labor the Uber doesn't have a status of nefesh, so why is it forbidden to abort a baby? What's the source of this prohibition? That's the key question that we have to deal with right now. So that nobody should think otherwise. It certainly is forbidden to abort a baby, because we have the principle of leka miyadam d'Yisrael shar l'nach ya'asu. That's the wording of the Gemara in Sanhedrin Daf Nun Tes. There's nothing that is permissible for a Jew, but is forbidden for a non-Jew. If it's forbidden for a non-Jew, it's certainly also forbidden for a Jew. The prohibition, Jews are subject to many more prohibitions than non-Jews. Now, the Gemara in Sanhedrin Nun Zayin, look at your reference sheets number 43. It's an important Gemara. The Gemara says, normally we're more stringent with Jews. There are some exceptions when we're more lenient with Jews and we're more stringent with non-Jews. Mostly pertaining to the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, the 7 Noachide laws. So, therefore, if a non-Jew murders, he's not subject to the same standards that would be held in a Jewish court. In a Jewish court, you wouldn't be allowed to rely on circumstantial evidence. You need to have 2 kosher witnesses that saw it themselves. But if it's a Noachide court, if you'd like, they might rely on aid mipi aid, testimony that had been passed on from one person to the next. They might choose, according to the prerogative, to even trust relatives. Okay, so there are many things that they would kill. There's less of a standard, unless they would more easily kill a non-Jew. They wouldn't demand such a high standard of evidence.
So are the penalties higher, like for example, Zayla?
Yeah, for example, for Gzeila. And again, because we saw the Drush at Haran, that the function of the Shev Mitzvah B'nai is in order to enforce law and order. It's in order that you should be able to have a functioning society. So therefore, the government has to gauge exactly what is necessary to enforce things. Okay, unless we mentioned that Rosh Feinstein was consulted by the governor of New York, and Rosh Feinstein said that you should implement the execution, capital punishment, only if it's necessary to retain law and order. Now, if you look at your reference sheet number 43, Rabbi Shmuel adds something else to the list. 3 lines from the bottom there. The Rabbi Shmuel, 4 lines from the top. Rabbi Shmuel Amar Afala Ubarim. A non-Jew could be subject to execution even if he kills a fetus. My time in Rabbi Shmuel, Shoifech Dam Ha'adam Ba'adam Dam Yishafech. That's Pasuk in Parshas Noach. Now, the simple translation of the Pasuk is, if somebody sheds blood, then he should be killed at the hand of man. That's the simple translation, but the Gemara is giving a midrashic interpretation that says, Shoifech Dam Ha'adam Ba'adam. Should one spill Adam, the life of an Adam that is inside of an Adam, namely the Uber. Eizu Adam Shubadam Hav Armiza Uber. So now that we've established that a non-Jew could be subject to the execution for having killed a fetus, then it cannot be permissible for a Jew to do that. There's no way that a non-Jew would be executed for killing a fetus and it would be permissible for a Jew. There's no way that that could be. Okay, so we've established now that it's forbidden to abort a baby. Next question is why? So we already briefly mentioned last week, right? It boils down to 4 reasons. It could be maybe divided up into 5 or 6, but generally 4 reasons. Right? The first reason is because of shazal, shub chazal avatala, wasting of seed or the wasting of potential, the potential for life, or chabala, one is not allowed to injure himself. The other reason is because you're stealing the right of the child to live. The child also has a right to live. We'll see at length that he also has monetary rights. And the other reason is because it could be bal tashchit, okay, which is probably related to the orbital perverivia, okay, which is connected to everything. So let's see the reasonings, the different reasonings on our reference sheet, and talk about. Let's take a look at reference. Reference 47, the Shud Marit. Okay, if you look at reference number 47, this is the reasoning of the Maharit, which, as an aside, we already saw that the Maharit said, Lav nefesh koldu. Fetus is not at all a nefesh. Okay? On no level is he a nefesh. That's what the Maharit said. Here the Maharit says, Lo yishar da'asu midin chabala. Self-injury. Self-injury is prohibited in halacha. So if one kills a fetus, it makes sense because we did see that gufahi, that the fetus is part of it's like a limb of the mother, if you'd like. So therefore, by aborting a fetus, she's like severing a limb of hers. Okay, so that's...
She's not the one who performs the abortion, though.
Okay, that's very good. She's not the one who performs the abortion, but whoever does perform the abortion would be guilty of causing injury to a person, which is also not allowed. Okay, so the Chabala, that's a good point. I want to get to that. because we're going to get to another discussion if there's a difference. Okay, hang on to that point because I'm going to get to that, I don't know today, but hopefully for the next year.
For a surgeon and normal surgery?
A normal surgery. Well, we said we began this year with a question from the Sridei Eish, where there's this doctor in Britain that says that if I don't perform abortion, I might lose my license to perform medicine.
I'm saying normal surgeries, appendix.
Okay, very good, excellent. So what about performing normal surgery? Okay, which is nice that Dr. Les mentioned that he had a question if he can operate on his father. Okay, okay, that was a real life question that Les had to ask when Les was in South Africa. Okay, so he says Chabala. Okay, now normally, obviously, Chabala would be mutter if the gain is more than the loss. It's interesting that you mentioned what about performing surgery. This is actually a question that the poskim dealt with, Ikris Moshe, in Choshen Mishpat, Teilel, Kuf Gimel. Are you allowed to let them take blood, but not to save a life, but for monetary compensation? He said they're running some sort of experiment, and let's say theoretically that it's not pekuach nefesh, that it's not necessary to save a life. I'm allowed to let myself be cut in order to get money. That's the question Moshe dealt with, or a similar question Sheva Levi dealt with. A woman is sweating from her palms, so there's too much sweat. She wants to do some surgeries to solve the problem. Okay. Ultimately, the post can say it's okay. It's not so clear as to why it's okay. Okay, because after all, there is a prohibition against injuring yourself. But apparently they seem to maintain that if there's some benefit to it, that doesn't fit the category of Chabala.
Even cosmetic surgery.
Yeah, even cosmetic surgery, exactly. Now, it's interesting that the Marid wants to say that aborting a fetus is under the prohibition of Chabala. In the Talmud, the prohibition of Chabala is discussed in Bava Kama Tzadi Aleph. It's in 40, I'm not sure, number 2. I'm sorry, that there's a supplementary reference sheet. So if you look at number 2, you'll see the Gemara in there in Bava Kama Tzadi Aleph. So the Gemara says, let's read it together. Which Tana asserted that it's forbidden for a person to injure himself? So the Gemara says, perhaps it's the following Tana stated in the Braisa. That's also pasuk in Parshas Noach, which the Chacham interpret to be a prohibition against suicide. Okay, that's where the Torah says one is not allowed to commit suicide. So Rabbi Lezer, I'm going to demand retribution for having taken your own life. So the Gemara rejects that and says V'dilma katalashani. Okay, that's about suicide, but who says that also includes the prohibition against injuring oneself? The final verdict of the Gemara there in Bava Kama Tzadi Aleph brings the famous teaching of Rabbi Lezer HaKapar. It says that Nazir, the Torah says that a Nazireth, he prohibits himself from drinking wine, and then he needs to bring an atonement for causing himself self-affliction. The Torah is against self-affliction. So the Gemara says that that's the source why one is not allowed to injure himself, because it's a form of infliction. But what is interesting that the Rishonim, the Rabbi Yonatan, the Meiri, and other Rishonim seem to assert that the Gemara didn't entirely reject that proposal, that the reason why you're not allowed to injure yourself is because it's under the same category of suicide. It's based on a Gemara in Bava Kama Samachay, which is number 52 in your reference sheet, where the Gemara states the principle, Mali Katla Kula Mali Katla Palga. When one draws blood, that's considered a partial death. Most people don't view it that way. The Talmud views drawing blood as partial death. Mali Katla Kula Mali Katla Palga, and it has actually very great halachic ramifications. The Gemara, the Mishnah in Shabbos Kuf Zayin says that if somebody causes somebody else to bleed for constructive, well, that's machlokas if it needs to be for a constructive purpose or not. But if somebody bruises an animal, it's a tolda, it's an extension of shochet. Shochet, taking a life, is one of the 39 categories of malacha, one of the 39 forbidden categories of work on the Shabbat. Under that category comes also injuring. So you see that when one injures and draws blood, it's a category of death, somewhat. And as we saw, that it can even be considered a desecration of the Shabbos. So therefore, these Rishonim learn, V'dilma katalashani, the Gemara was looking for a source. How do you know that it's forbidden to injure yourself, even when there's no blood. There's a lot of archaic religions. I don't know if they still probably still. I'm sure in the tribes in Africa and in the Amazon, they have all sorts of customs where they beat themselves and hurt themselves. So even if there's no blood, it's prohibited because the Torah is against self-affliction. The Torah even requires that the Nazir brings an atonement, so certainly you're not allowed to hurt yourself even if there's no blood. But if there is blood, then it's more serious because then it's also almost like under the category of suicide. Achas dimchem v'nafshesechem edrish malikat la kula malikat la palga. Okay?
Would boxing be asur?
Yeah, boxing would be asur. You wouldn't be allowed to engage in boxing where you punch the guy in the nose and you cause him to bleed. That wouldn't be allowed because that would be a form of affliction. Yeah. Good point. Thank you for pointing that out. Okay, so causing an abortion, right, whether there is blood or whether there's not blood, it's certainly katla palaga. You're taking away potential for life, and it's almost inevitable when there's abortions, also loss of blood. But I'm saying even theoretically, if you can perform an abortion without blood, then it certainly would be under the category of chabala. Okay, so that's reason number one. We've addressed it in a pretty satisfactory way. But the thing is, when there's a need to perform an abortion, we could override this category, we can override this problem, because as we see, when there's a need, we don't prohibit surgeries. Okay, even cosmetic surgery, even the maskan of the Shevet HaLevi was to permit this woman to have surgery in order to cure the problem that her hand was extremely sweaty. Rav Moshe Feinstein doesn't come up with a clear verdict if it's okay to let them cut you and take blood just to get money. That he doesn't come up with a clear verdict. I forgot to mention, one of the previous listeners I passed over, we talked about the Rambam, the birth, right? The Gemara in Edom that day says that, we mentioned this last year, that when a woman gives birth, she has the nida status. She assumes the nida status whether or not there was a discharge of blood. What is the point of birth? It has great ramifications to determine what day a baby is going to have his bris milah. It has ramifications to know, in certain cases of pidyon haben, okay, because when a C-section is performed, there's no pidyon haben. The Gemara in Chulin questions what happens if you wrap the baby before he comes out. The Gemara is not sure if you can perform a pidyon haben chatzitza. So it's very important to determine the exact timing of birth. It's a very complicated topic. It involves a very lengthy shear in female anatomy, and it's really not clear. The Gemara in Nida Membeis talks about it. Rashi there says that the child is considered to be born even before he comes out fully, meaning to say even before he comes out to see the air of the world, the airspace of the world. It says mi yatsa lip prosdar. Now prosdar literally means an anteroom. They use the more euphemistic terms to describe the anatomy of a woman. So it described part of the anatomy of the woman, the birth canal, that described it presumably the prosdor, the anteroom before you get into the actual uterus. Now there's two interpretations. What do I mean yotza lip prosdor? Right? Does that mean that the baby goes into the prosdor? Right? Or does it mean when the baby leaves the prosdor? Right? It's a big machloket. Not only that, it's not even clear where the prosdor begins. The Gemara describes between the shinayim, between the teeth. There seems to be at the end of the uterus some sort of part of the female anatomy that looks like teeth. And Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says nobody really has it so clear exactly what that part of the body is. But if you look at the Gemara there in Membeis, the Rashi, the Ritva, the Meiri, the Piskei Rashbeit, I'm sorry I didn't bring this on the reference sheet because it wasn't that relative to the topic of abortion. They learn that the point of birth is even before the baby actually comes out to see the airspace of the world. Once he enters the prosdor, which we can assume is the birth canal. So as soon as the child enters the birth canal, he's out of the uterus. That's already the point of birth. Other Rishonim, the Rav Yod, the Zarua, the Tosfot Mechud, and Ein Beis, and perhaps other Rishonim, they seem to say no. The point of birth is when the baby actually comes out to see And if you want to research this topic before, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef has a very good summary of it. He gives it a very good treatise in Taharat Habayit, Chelik Beis Amud Ein Chet. You can have a look at that. The reason why I mentioned it is because one of the online viewers pointed this out. He says you keep on mentioning that the baby comes out of the uterus, right? Don't you mean the birth canal? So I said, okay. I'm not surprised that listener picked it up. She happens to be the one who gave birth to 9 children, so it's not, none of us here, I didn't think that anybody would take notice of it. But again, I don't think it would make a difference according to the Rambam. According to the Rambam, you have to look at it from a purely medical perspective. At what point in time is the child no longer endangering the mother? We're talking about a dangerous birth. So we did point out in the end of the shir, it's very plausible that according to the Rambam, and the Rambam indicates that way, that when he talks about when a woman assumes the nida status, he talks about when the forehead exits. When he talks about when the child is no longer a rodev, he says when the head exits, which could be explained. It's logical because, again, the child is a rodev because he could be threatening to cause the woman's vital, certain important arteries to burst. Maybe he may be causing the mother excessive bleeding or whatever else, all the other theories we talked about, okay? So, Chabala, right, we can deal with. Right? Obviously, to save a life, there's no question about it that we can override the problem of Chabala. So therefore, if you want to get back to the cases that we began with, even if the child is not a rodev, you need to, even if you want to extract some vital component from the embryonic sac or whatever else, in order to save, we talked about the case of child needs to be saved from leukemia, whatever it is, you can kill a child, there's no problem of Chabala in that case. Okay, the next category, we're talking about shazal. Shazal means the wasting of seed. Typically, shazal means onanism, to waste seed. Surely, right, killing a child is no less severe than wasting seed, wasting semen, right? The child is obviously an even greater status of life than wasting semen. So that definitely is a category. If you look, right, reference number 53, the Chavat Yair makes this suggestion. The Chavat Yair, in reference number 53, he says that the reason why it's prohibited to perform an abortion, again, he says, Le'odov mi nachem ba'alim shochte yiladim. The Chazal, the halacha is very, very stringent about wasting seed. It considers it a very severe sin. So he says killing a child is certainly no less severe. Comes the Mishpatei Uziel, Ben Sion Meir Chai Uziel, who was also the Rav Harashi. He was the Rishon LeZion. He worked alongside Rav Kook. Okay, so Rav Kook was the Ashkenazic chief rabbi. He worked alongside the Mishpatei Uziel. So he comes along and he raises a difficulty with the Chavat Yair, and he says, we saw the Gemara in Erechin Daf Zayin says that you can perform an abortion to uphold the dignity of the mother. You don't want the mother to be executed and then there's a whole mess of blood and it doesn't look nice for the mother. So therefore we perform an abortion before the execution. Asks Rav Uziel, 1 minute, are you allowed to be motzi zer levatal? Are you allowed to waste your seed to uphold somebody's dignity? We've never seen that. No reason to assume that you should be allowed to waste seed. So what permits us to violate the prohibition of shivchazer levatala just so that the woman should have dignity? That's the difficulty that the Chavat Yair has with the Chavat Yair. Now, the solution is really eloquent, right, and fairly simple. And Rav Moshe Feinstein does a wonderful job clarifying this. He mentions the truth in a few places. Rav Moshe Feinstein clarifies the entire topic of shivchazer levatala, of wasting seed. I'm trying to see if I put it here on the reference sheet somewhere. Please excuse me.
Don't we normally think of that like onanism at the moment of the
ejaculation?
Or using, say, contraceptive pads.
Very good.
And here it is 9 months later.
Very good. Yeah. So hold on to that comment because it's a good point. Okay. So basically, what Rav Moshe Feinstein does, I think it's over here early. Yes, Igros Moshe Even Ezer Chelik Beis Simin Yud Ches. Now, the reason why Rav Moshe had to write this tshuva is because he was asked if women are allowed to use contraceptives. Now, today, there's different forms of contraceptives. Then, the very basic, simple way to do contraceptive is to put a sponge, just to put up a stud before relations, and that would block the seed from getting to the egg cell. Okay, so he asked if that's okay. Now, Moshe Feinstein points out a very important principle that pertains to the Yisur Shivchazer levatala. There are 2 components that are involved in this prohibition that are neither mutually exclusive and neither are they mutually inclusive. There's a Gemara Nida Yudalid that says Lo Tin'af, it's very small. The Chachamim, the rabbis, they expanded the interpretation of lo tinaf not just to mean adultery, but also to mean when one has sexual relations with oneself. Lo tinaf, leisinaf biyad uberegel. So there's even a medrash like that, when an interesting medrash that says that onanism, the person is both the bo'el, which is the male role in the sexual act, and he's also the nival, the female partner in the sexual act. He plays both roles. Right? That's how the medrash views onanism. So lo tinaf, the Chacham expanded that interpretation to include onanism. That's the first component of the Isser. Okay? There's another component of the Isser, which is based on the Gemara in Avodah Zarah Daf Chav, the Gemara in Ketuvah Daf Memches, which says, Yishar Melocha, the Torah warns us not to have sexual fantasies during the day, because then it might lead to a nocturnal emission at night. So there the Torah says that we don't want seed to be wasted. Obviously, nocturnal emission isn't included in the prohibition of lo tinaf. It has nothing to do with that. So those are the two distinct, maybe related, but distinct components of Shulchan Aruch. The first one is that it's a prohibited sexual act, number one, and number two, there's a prohibition against causing a waste of seed. It's very, very important to distinguish between these two components, because many times you'll have one component without the other. Most notably, the Gemara in Yevamot, Daf Ayin Vav, it's number 3 in the supplementary reference sheet. It's number 3. Okay, have a look at the Gemara in Ayin Vav. The Gemara is dealing with a suffix krut shivcha. Krut shivcha is somebody who has a severed male member. So the Gemara says, what happens if there is a hole in the male member? Does he have the status of a krut shivcha? Meaning to say, is he allowed to get married to a Jewish woman? Because a krut shivcha is not allowed to marry a Jewish-born woman. So the Gemara says that if when you ejaculate, if let's say there's a hole there, but some sort of membrane or scab or whatever it is grew above the hole in the male member, so we don't know if he has the status of krut shivcha. It depends on if he ejaculates, does the hole open up or does it hold? If when he ejaculates the covering still holds, then he doesn't have the status of krut shivcha, otherwise he does. Okay, he wants to get married. Fair enough. How are we going to determine, right, if let's call it the membrane that developed, is it going to hold when he ejaculates, and how are we supposed to know? So the Gemara gives us two options. One option is either he should look at beautiful clothing of a woman that he knows, and he should become sexually aroused and hope that will lead to a nocturnal emission. That's the first eight the Gemara gives. The second eight the Gemara gives, which Rav Moshe Feinstein points out, we don't know how to do it. You take barley dough and you put it on his anus. It's whatever. It sounds a bit bizarre, but it heats him, whatever. Okay. So the question is, what happened to the problem of Shivcha Zera Levatala? Says Rav Moshe Feinstein, there's no onanism going on over here. You only have the second component of the prohibition, which is not to cause seed to be wasted. This is not a waste of seed. This is in order to enable him to get married. Okay. Important point there, right? So Rav Moshe Feinstein, this is the way the Yam Shel Shlomo learns, and that's the Rogatchover and Safnas Paneach learn, that we would not permit him to engage in onanism to determine if he's a krut shivcha, but we would allow him to have an nocturnal emission, or to cause in a roundabout way to cause him to have a. Now Moshe Feinstein, based on this important distinction, he says, in that case, if a woman cannot get pregnant, if she gets pregnant, she might be in some sort of dangerous situation. Okay, so she's allowed to engage in the contraception of causing the seed to go to waste. So certainly yes, because it's not onanism, it's legitimate relations between a husband and a wife. So it's definitely not onanism, and it's not either a waste of seed, because this enables their shalom bayis. This enables their marital harmony. So it's not. So in other words, just as the Gemara permitted a suffix krut shivcha to cause an nocturnal emission, by that same token, you'll allow a couple to engage in relations. It comes into play also when a couple has to use a condom. If Moshe Feinstein says, based on my svara, a couple, if there's no other option, then they will be allowed to use a condom if that's the only way, right? Because it's not onanism, and it's not either causing the seed to go to waste.
How about in vitro fertilization? husband.
Yeah. So that's a very good question. The poskim all deal with this. There's a child, a couple struggling with infertility, so the doctors need a sample of the semen. So is he allowed to engage? So Moshe finds the next opinion, no, right? You cannot engage in onanism, because that component we won't allow, even if there's a benefit. But we will allow, okay, he says we should take a barley dough and put, that's it. Wishful thinking if you think you're going to manage that, right? And he says not everybody is going to have an nocturnal mission because they see nice clothing belonging to a woman either, right? That's not either going to help. So there are a few options, right? One option is that the couple engage in relations in the doctor's office, and then they extract it, I don't know, with a vacuum of some sort. Rav Tzitza considers that the most ideal option. Rav Moshe says, no, God forbid, that's not allowed. That's extremely immodest. The doctor should be waiting outside while he knows the couple is having relations in the doctor's office. He says, no, I won't hear of that. Rav Tzitza says, you're wrong. That is the best option. Rav Moshe says, I won't hear of it. Rav Moshe surprisingly prefers what I think they call coitus interruptus. I think that's the term, which was the act of Erev Onan, according to one interpretation of the Gemara in Ido, where basically the Gemara terms is dash b'fneim v'zareh b'chutz, which, I don't know, a person has to be a bit on top of his game to do that. So to engage relations, then coitus interruptus, where he causes the ejaculation to happen into outside the body of the woman. Okay, so according to Moshe Feinstein, that's the better option. Okay, can you actually engage in onanism? According to Moshe Feinstein, no. Even a child, even if the couple is suffering from infertility, but Moshe won't allow onanism. Neither will the Yam Shlomo, the Marshal, and in fact they inferred from the Gemara. The Gemara says if you have a Krush Shivcha, the Gemara never suggested that he should engage in onanism. The Gemara only said that he should look at woman's clothing and then cause an nocturnal emission to happen at night. That's the only suggestion the Gemara made. However, it should not be denied that according to the Yavitz, and according to quite a few other Achronim, Rav Chaim Ozer Grodensky accepts the position of the Yavitz, that if the only way to extract the seed is onanism, the Gemara would have allowed onanism too. Okay? But in any case, getting back to the difficulty that the Mishpat Uziel has with the Chavis Yoyer, how could you cause the baby to die? Right? The answer is very simple. It's not onanism. Abortion is not onanism. If abortion would have been onanism, indeed, we wouldn't abort the baby to uphold the dignity of the mother. It's zer levatala. It only has the second component of the prohibition. So since it only has the second component of the prohibition, and it's not for naught, there is a legitimate reason, then as long as something is not onanism, and there's a legitimate reason for the seed to go to waste, then there's no problem. That's what we found by Asafa Krushivcha. That's what the poskim are matter for couples suffering with infertility, and that's exactly why we perform an abortion on the mother. Okay, that is the answer to the Mishpat Uziel's difficulty which is also an important point. Are you allowed to perform an abortion to save life? Of course, right? If you're allowed to cause a seed to go to waste to enable to enable a couple that suffered from infertility to be able to have a child, if you're allowed to cause seed to go to, say, quote unquote, waste to determine if somebody's a krishivcha, of course, so it's not really wasting it, correct? So obviously, you would be allowed to cause an abortion to save a life. It goes without question. Saving a life is even more important than enabling a suffer krishivcha to marry. Okay? So far, so clear? Okay. So we've dealt with Chabala, we've dealt with Shiv Chazer Levatala. It should be very important to mention the poskim. The poskim discuss a very important point. It's number 60 on your reference sheet. There's a Tosas there, Ksuvas Lamed Tesam and Aleph, that discusses post-coital contraception, which means to say after a woman engaged in a relation, she wants to clean out her vagina, whatever it is, in order that she should not get pregnant. Okay, post-coital contraception. So the question is, that allowed or not? So Rabbi Tam actually wanted to permit it. Right? He says, why? Because a woman is not commanded to do perivirivia. So therefore there should be no reason to do it. But most of the Rishonim disagree with Rabbi Tam. They say that it's even a woman is not allowed to engage in postcoital contraception unless there's a compelling reason to do so. But if there's no justification for doing so, it's not allowed. Okay, that's, as you can see in your reference sheet number 60, that's where Tosfos says that a woman can't try to kill, to clean out the seed inside of her. The question is why? So it says the Aruch Laner, okay, it's number 6 on your supplementary reference sheet. Right, it says the Aruch Laner, it's rooted in the prohibition of Bal Tashchit. One of the suggestions the Gemara in Bava Kama Tzadei Aleph, the Gemara in Tzadei was searching for a source to determine why it's prohibited to injure yourself. One of the things the Gemara wanted to say is Bal Tashchit. The Gemara rejected it. The Gemara said no. Bal Tashchit is with clothing, something that's ruined and something that cannot be repaired. That's when you have the prohibition of Bal Tashchit. To cut down a fruit tree that won't be able to be repaired, that's Bal Tashchit. But if somebody hurts himself, that's not Bal Tashchit. He'll heal. The damage will be repaired. So the Gemara rejected that option. Comes the Aruch Laner and says, but if it's irreparable damage, like an abortion, or wasting seed, a woman has the potential to become pregnant and bring a healthy, viable child into the world, and she engages in postcoital contraception, it's Bal Tashchit. It's a waste because she's causing a waste of potential life that cannot be repaired. Okay, that's the suggestion of the Aruch Laner. So if we accept the notion of the Aruch Laner, there's also an issue of Bittul Pirvurivya, which is subject even to people that are not commanded to engage in Pirvurivya. Women are not subject to the obligation of Pirvurivya, but it's Bal Tashchit, it's waste. It's a waste of life. I very much, you mentioned that to me the other week, that according to the Rambam, why are we Mechal the Shabbat? Why do we desecrate what would otherwise be desecration of the Shabbos in order to save a fetus? Because so that the life should not be wasted. The child could eventually come out into the world and be a productive human being. It would be a great pity to waste it, right? And in fact, it's such a degree of waste that we even permit desecrating the Shabbos. So it's the greatest form of Bal Tashchis that one could think of. It's a form of Bal Tashchis for which we actually desecrate the Shabbos. Okay? So is it Bal Tashchis to perform an abortion in order to save a life? That's not Bal Tashchis. No one would imagine for a second that if you're aborting the fetus, so you should to get some life-saving component from the fetus to save a child with leukemia. There's no Bal Tashchis. So therefore, whether the child is a rodef or not, right? If you're killing a child to save a life, or let's say the doctor in Auschwitz who's performing an abortion to be saved in order that he should not lose his life, there's no issue of onanism. There's no issue of shechazeh levatala because there's a great purpose. It's greater than the purpose to permit a savik to marry. There's no Bal Tashchis involved. There's no, we said there's no chabala, there's no self-injury, the factor of self-injury doesn't apply. The greatest issue we get to is the fourth category as to why we permit it is because of the child's monetary rights. We know that the child has the capacity to receive an inheritance, okay? There are few examples of this where you see the child having monetary rights. The strongest example is the Gemara Bava Batra Daf Kuf Mem Beis. It's number 8 on your supplemental reference sheet. Have a look at the Gemara in Bava Batra Kuf Mem Beis. We'll read it together. Tanya, the rabbis taught, Ger Shemetu, you have a convert to Judaism that died. So a convert to Judaism could have no potential heir. It's possible he has no potential heirs. Every person that's born Jewish has a Jewish heir. It's not a son, it's a brother, uncle, cousin, first cousin, etc., etc. But if somebody is a convert to Judaism, it's possible that he has no heirs. So what happens is if the ger, the convert, dies and leaves over property, then it's hefker. In legal law, I believe that it's property of the state. In halacha, there's no such thing as somebody's inheritance automatically belonging to the state. It's the first person to seize the property, to make a kinyan, to make an acquisition. He's the person who's privileged to take the property of the ger. So this is what the Gemara in Bava Basra Kuf Mem Beis is discussing, that you have this ger that died, and then it was assumed that he had no heirs, so somebody grabbed the property of the convert. Ben either it becomes discovered that he has a child, but it's enough to have discovered that at the time of the death, his wife, the deceased's wife, was pregnant. So chayav al, so in that case you have to give it back. So you see that the child already has a right on the Yerusha. He has already made some level of acquisition on the property of the convert. That's also the ruling of the Shulchan Aruch. In Siman Reish Ayin Hey, Sif Lamed, you can see number 9 in your reference. You see that's the ruling of the. But in addition to that, right, one of the points, right, we skipped over this point, kind of, right, but it's also Gemara in Nida Daf Mem Dalid. If you look at number 69 in your reference sheet, Rav Sheshet, it says Rav Sheshet, we're reading that together again, number 69 in the main reference sheet. Rav Sheshet, Nochel b'nichse'ei, v'hanchel av meneim. If a child if a baby is 1 day old, then he gets an inheritance in the property of his mother to pass it on to the brothers. Okay, so you have a man, he has children from 2 wives. So one of the wives, if the child inherits his mother, inherits the property of the mother, and then he could thereafter pass it over. If he dies afterwards, he can pass it over to the brothers, the paternal brothers. Okay? So the Gemara says there, this is a Gemara again in Nida Daf Mem Daled, it also appears in the Gemara in Erech in Daf Zayin, V'daf Kobo B'yamachar, only if he's 1 day old. Aval Ober, but if he's a fetus, my time was the reason to whom my inspiration, because he dies before the mother. In order for him to inherit the mother, we need to have the sequence of events as follows. First, the mother dies, passes it on to the child, and then the child, at the next stage, passes it on to the paternal brothers. However, if he dies first, he's not alive to receive the inheritance from his mother. Right? Because an Uber, or seems as if the Malach Hamav is the angel of death, goes after the fetus first, because the fetus is the weaker of the two. He's weaker than the mother, so the angel of death goes after the fetus before he goes after the mother. Okay, so that's what the Gemara asserts. However, the Gemara in Erechin, and Tosis points this out there in Nida, that if he's after the point of Akar, if the mother's gone into labor, then it's not necessarily so. Then the mother could die before the child. How do we know? Because we said that if the mother dies in childbirth, if it's Shabbos, you carry your knife to cut open the mother. Ask Tosis what's going on over here. You always say that the child dies before the mother, so if the mother's dead, how could the fetus be alive? So he says that's only before the mother goes into labor, before Akar Vlad. But after Akar Vlad, then indeed it is possible that the mother died first, and then the child died. So the Meiri points it out explicitly, but it's obvious. The Gemara is saying that the issue here is that he dies before the mother. But theoretically, if he doesn't die before the mother, and Tosis says it explicitly, if he already went into labor, then he would be able to receive an inheritance from the mother. So that's another proof that a child, a fetus, he may not be called a nefesh, but counterintuitively, he does have the capacity to own property. He does have monetary legal rights, which is a surprising point. The Chavis Yor also points out, it's in number 73 in your reference sheet, the Chavis Yor says he's not called a nefesh, but he's called an adam. How do I know that? From the pasuk in Noach, Shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam. What did the Gemara say? That's referring to a fetus. So this is a little bit of a question of semantics to define it. It's very difficult, but he's not a nefesh, however you define nefesh, but he's an adam. And what we're seeing now that he's enough of an Adam to have legal rights, to be able to have monetary acquisition, which is an interesting point. Which leads us probably to the most problematic point in abortion. Are you allowed to steal the child's life in order to save a life? Can you force him to forfeit, and he's not even able to convey his wishes, so you can't even know if he's willing to forfeit his life. Okay? So which brings us to a very important point that brings us, look at 78, please, on your reference sheet. This brings us to the discussion, are you allowed to steal in order to save a life? Okay, which is a very interesting topic. If you look at your reference sheet, you have the Psukim Divrei Yomim, Aleph Perikut Aleph. It's also a similar account of events in Shmuel Beis. Right, here we quoted the Psukim in, we're talking, the Pasuk describes all of David HaMelech's great warriors. One of them was Eleazar ben Dodo, And then the Pasuk describes a certain war that he engaged in. He was the hero of a certain battle with Plishtim. And the Pasuk says, they were amidst a field of some sort, and he managed to kill a great number of Plishtim. So the Pasuk is a bit obscure about what went on in the battle, but the Gemara Bava Kama and Daf Samach gives us a little bit more detail. The Gemara Bava Kama Daf Samach, you can see number 78 on your reference sheet, Plishtim were hiding in a field of grain. Now the grain belonged to a Jewish owner. So David HaMelech wanted to set the entire field of grain on fire in order to kill the Plishtim that were hiding there, but he wasn't sure if that was allowed because in the process he would also be stealing or causing damage to the owner of the field. Okay? So Shol Chulei, he sent a message to the Sanhedrin. And what did the Sanhedrin say? You're not allowed to save yourself by taking somebody else's money. But you're a king. The king has the prerogative to seize property. If it's for the good of the state, a king is allowed to seize property. So superficial reading of the Gemara seems to be saying that you're not allowed to steal to save a life. Come all the Rishonim, you can see in reference number 79, the Tosfot, and in reference number 80, I mentioned that the Ramban and Mulchamot and Bava Kama, the Rosh and Bava Kama, the Rabbi, and many other Rishonim say that's impossible. Right? There's no way that you should not be allowed to steal in order to save a life. We know that there are only 3 cardinal sins for which you have to give up your life: Shvichas Damim, Gila Rayot, and Avodah Zarah. The Gemara Yuma, Pei Beis. So why should you not be allowed to steal? In fact, it's...
Does steal mean without repaying?
Oh, so very good. So that's what the Rishonim said. Rishonim meant to say, David HaMelech wanted to know if he would have to repay after burning down the field. That was his question. So of course you're allowed to steal to save a life. But since I stole in order to save a life, maybe I don't need to repay. So the Gemara says, no, you do need to repay. So when you steal to save a life, you have to do it with intention that you're going to pay the person back. That's what the pasuk means. Okay? So it's unlike Rashi. The Prashas Drach in the Mishnah Melech already points out that Rashi seems to say you're not allowed to steal in order to save a life, but it's a little hard to justify such a position, right? In fact, the position is not entirely rejected because there's a Raisa Chisonit, which means to say a Raisa that didn't really make it into the corpus of rabbinic literature. The Ramban brings this, that there's a Shita of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says that the Gezel is actually the 4th Aveir for which you have to give up your life. I don't think I brought this here on the reference sheet. Okay. Oh, here, 89. I did bring it. Look at 89 on your reference sheet. In fact, even better, look at 88. Look more on 2 votes. Right there, the Gemara talks about a case where witnesses are being threatened to sign a document falsely. So they're being told either you sign the document or we're going to kill you. So what does Rava there say? So the Gemara says they're not Rishayim. In fact, they did the right thing. Of course, they did the right thing to sign. Wow, time really flies when you're having fun, right? So as far as that they did the right thing to sign the document. So they're not Rishayim. There are only 3 cardinal sins. Comes the Ramban there in reference 89. He brings a Braita Chitzonit, a Braita which is a Tanaic teaching that, again, that as I explained, didn't make the corpus of rabbinic literature, or the primary rabbinic literature, that Rabbi Meir holds Afala Gezel, that in addition to the 3 cardinal sins, also Gezel will reject that position. So which means that we've laid down the important principle that you're allowed to steal to save a life, if you intend to repay. Which brings us to a very critical question. What happens if you're not able to repay? You know that you won't be able to repay. As you have already figured out, brings us to the crux of abortion. Abortion is a type of theft. You're stealing the over's life, but you won't be able to repay. There's a fascinating tshuva from the from the Aruch Laner. The Aruch Laner was the Rav in Altona. Altona today is in Hamburg. The Yavitz is buried in Altona. The Chacham Tzvi was the Rav in Altona. The Aruch Laner, Yaakov Ettlinger, he was the Gadol Hadar. He was the Rebbe Rav Shamshon of Fall Hirsch and of Israel Hildesheimer, important German rabbi. So, besides for his famous work, the Aruch Laner also has a Shut Binyan Tzion. In the Shut Binyan Tzion, he discusses autopsies. Okay? He talks about a rare, somebody had contracted some sort of rare disease, and the doctors believed that if they were to perform an autopsy on another body, then they would be able to get more information about this disease and they would be able to save the life. So the question was brought to the Aruch Laner, are we allowed to perform an autopsy to save a life? So the Aruch Laner has two mind-boggling novelties which have not been accepted l'halacha. First thing that he assumes is that performing an autopsy on a dead body is a form of theft, which is a big chiddush. The Chatam Sofer totally disagreed with that. The Chatam Sofer slightly before him. The Chatam Sofer explains explicitly that bizu hameis, mutilating a corpse, is not theft. It's a problem of moel beheklet, moel b'isur hana. The body is something you're not allowed to get benefit from. Okay, which leads us to an interesting question about cannibalism. I'm not going to get off topic onto the whole topic of cannibalism. There's a big machloket if you're allowed to, if the Isra knows by a Jewish body or also a non-Jewish body, is a whole other discussion.
Was that discussed by the Nodin Yehuda, the autopsies?
I'm not aware of the Nodin Yehuda, perhaps. Maybe. Very well could be. I didn't see it anywhere. I'm only aware of the Binyan Sion. So he makes the first assumption that autopsy is a form of theft, which has not been accepted in Allah. Okay? That's his first assumption. Then he gets on to the next assumption, that you're not allowed to steal if you're not able to pay back. Extraordinary chidush, and therefore he prohibited performing an autopsy even to save a life. Came the Maram Shik, Moshe Shik was the Talmud of the Chatam Sofer, belonged to the Hungarian rabbinate, which were generally more zealous. They were more conservative, much more militant. But surprisingly, he says, you're totally wrong. He totally disagrees with Rabbi Yaakov. He says, first of all, performing an autopsy is not a form of theft. That's number one. And number two, the obligation to pay back is when you could pay back, but the principle that there are only three cardinal sins for which you have to give up a life is an ironclad rule. There are no exceptions to this rule. There are many proofs that there are no exceptions to this rule. One of them being the Gemara that we saw, right? The Rabbi Tater of Chisda, that there are only three cardinal sins for which you have to give up your life, period. There are no exceptions. That's what Rabbi stated to Rav Chisda. So he says you have to pay back if you're able to pay back, but if you're not able to pay back, then you're allowed to steal in order to save a life. That's the position of the Maram Shik. And if you look at your reference sheet, the Maram Shik is the accepted position in halacha. First of all, if you'd like to see the Maram Shik, reference 85 on your sheet, that's also the position of the Maharsham, Rabbi Shalom Shvadron, who's the Posek Hadar Galicia, the leading posing of his generation. I inferred it from the Chatam Sofer, the Dov Mishram, the Chibinarov. Right? They all state explicitly that you're allowed to steal to save a life, even if you won't be able to pay back. Which therefore brings us to the verdict, right? To the question that we asked: you're allowed to kill the baby before labor. Is there a problem of stealing? No, there's no problem of stealing. But to save a life, then you're allowed to perform the abortion. The doctor in Auschwitz is threatened, kill the baby, or otherwise I'm going to take your life. He's allowed to steal from the baby. In order to save a life, you're allowed to engage in theft, even when you cannot pay back. Okay? So which means that we've gone through all four categories of the prohibition. We've said that it's not Chabala, no issue of Chabala if it's to save a life. There's no issue of Zer Levatala, there's no issue of theft, there's no issue of Baltash. None of these issues apply when it's in order to save a life. However, and this really kind of lets us to the critical point, which gives me I have about between 2 and 4 minutes to get to the point. However, I'd like to make a strong case as follows. How about aborting a baby that has Tay-Sachs or Down syndrome? There, right, we have a major problem because we're not allowed to take the life of the child. The child that has Tay-Sachs, he does have a monetary life to live. You can't ask the child, are you willing to forego 3-4 years of life that you've been granted to live? We have no prerogative to decide for him. We should be allowed to take away those 3-4 years of life that he's going to be in the world. Chaye Sha'ah, for all matters, you're Mechal Shabbat, even to save 10 minutes of life, you're Mechal Shabbat. In other words, let's put it this way, right? if you look at your reference sheets, right, we talk about the classic case. You look at number 10 in your supplementary. This brings us back to the supplementary reference sheet. Famous case, it's the Yerushalmi end of Trumot, Eikberg of Trumot. The group comes and demands a life. He says, give us one person, otherwise we're going to kill all of you. So the verdict there is that if they don't identify who they want, you can't hand anybody over. Nobody has the right to choose. What happens if there's a child with Tay-Sachs? You say, let's hand over the child with Tay-Sachs. He anyways only has another 2 or 3 years to live. Would that be permissible? Absolutely not. I say this with complete certainty. What if there's somebody there who's Down syndrome? Of course not. There's nothing to talk about. Okay? We're not granted that prerogative to decide which life has more value than... We're just not given that license. Okay? If you look there in the reference sheet, the famous Gemara Numa, Daf Pei Beis, number 13 in your reference sheet. Somebody came in front of Rabbi, and he said that the governor said, either you kill so-and-so or I'm going to kill you. So Rabbi said the famous line, how do you know your blood is redder than his blood? You can't take that prerogative to kill him. What if that child was a child with Tay-Sachs? He says, kill the child with Tay-Sachs, I'm going to kill your life. Does the principle of Damach Tidach Sumuk Tvei, does it still play? Of course it does. There's an important principle from Mishkat, Sfat Emet, and other things. They said, really the way we learned that, the Gemara says that it's logic that you can't kill somebody else to save your life. The Gemara says there's a bridge between what happens if somebody's, how do we know that a person has to give up his life to avoid sexual transgression? Obviously a high level of sexual transgression, live with a married woman, because it's linked to the topic of death. So the Sfas Emes of Shimon Shkab and many other Acharonim say that once the two are linked, right, it becomes an ironclad rule without any exceptions that you never commit murder in order to save your life, even if theoretically you don't have the logic of who says what if I could prove that my blood is redder? He has only an hour to live. He's a child with Tay-Sachs. He's whatever else. No, you can't do this. It's an ironclad rule because the Torah took away that prerogative to choose which life is more valuable. So therefore, if somebody wants to perform an abortion because the child has Tay-Sachs, what you're saying is basically, I'm going to choose for you that I'm going to speak on your behalf, and I'm going to say that you have to relinquish the 3 or 4 years of life that you've been granted. I'm also going to determine that the hardship of raising and the anguish of raising a child with Tay-Sachs is more valuable than your 3 or 4 years of life. We're not granted that prerogative. So therefore, I'm making the following case. I'm saying as follows, and I think we're going to finish this year with this, and then maybe the next year we'll move on. The truth is, I didn't want to get to the whole topic of a child in the first 40 years of the first 40 days about that abortion. So maybe we'll save it for the next year. But I'm making a case as follows. We have here a spectrum. Rav Moshe Feinstein says abortion is Ritzicha Gomer. Okay, he based it on an inference from the Rambam. Right? It's hard to justify the opinion because the Rambam only talked about a child after the mother went into labor. So we don't have any compelling proof to believe the Rambam considered a nefesh before labor. Okay? So therefore, we have the other end. We have the Tzitz Eliezer who's at the other end of the spectrum that says you can kill a child, right? Even if it's to save anguish. I've made a case here, I think, that you can't really do that because you're taking the prerogative to choose for the child that he should forego, that he should forfeit his 3-4 years of life, which you don't have the license to do. Okay? They even wanted to permit Down syndrome, which I think is even more problematic because there are people that live happy, productive lives as people that have. I mean, obviously they're not as functional as most of us, but I'm thinking right now of one boy with Down syndrome who has a chavruta every day. He works in the makol and he happens to actually be quite a happy, functioning person. So I'm saying that no, we can't take that position either. I'm saying we have to take the shvil hazal, we have to take the middle ground, right? Which is, there are 4 possible reasons why abortion is prohibited. All of these reasons are waived when it's done to save a life or to preserve a life. or to prevent being killed or whatever. But otherwise, right, I don't think that it's justifiable to take the life of a child in order to avoid anguish. For example, to kill a child that has potential Tay-Sachs or a child that's determined to have Down syndrome. That's the position, that's the case that I'd like to advocate. Okay, we'll stop over here. We didn't quite finish the topic of abortion. We'll finish it up next week because there are a few other points that I want to talk about. Okay, so we'll stop over here. Okay, thank you for your time.
Go ahead.
Okay, shkot everybody.